Miss Nobody from Nowhere by Elizabeth Ashton. Chapter 10. Angela lingered in London for another few days. She wanted to make certain that her suspicion was correct, and that entailed a visit to a doctor and a laboratory test. The doctor she went to was the one who had attended her family, so he was no stranger to him. And he too had heard she had perished with her father, and was surprised and delighted to find that she had survived and had a husband to take care of. "I brought you into the world, Anne," he told her, "though you'll hardly remember that." "I hope you'll attend me too." Excuse me. "Past it now, I'm afraid. I'm retiring soon, and I'm not up in all the latest obstetrics. Besides," he glanced at his notes, "you live in the country." "I could come up for consultations." "Better to stay quiet at home. Doubtless your husband has his own doctor who he would prefer to look after you." That brought her back to Clive and the question of his reaction to her news. Would he be pleased or dismayed? But now there was going to be a living bond between them. He would have to become reconciled to her. She telephoned Abbotsford to give the time of her arrival and asked for a car to meet at the station. It was Ralph who answered her call. "Thank goodness you're coming back," he exclaimed. "The house has been dead without you, and it's several weeks until I could take up my new job." He had had to give a month's notice. "How is Mrs. Stratton?" she asked anxiously. "Improving, but I'll give you all the news when I come to meet you." She hung up, thinking how much she would miss him when he left Abbotsford. He had done so much to make her stay there endurable. But it wasn't Ralph who was waiting on the platform for her train to arrive. Her heart leapt as she caught sight of him. Although casually dressed, he stood out among the nondescript collection of people waiting for the train, his bared head proudly held, very much the lord of the manor. He saw her at once and came striding towards her to take her case. "So you've come back," he observed. Impossible to decide from his inscrutable expression whether he was pleased or otherwise. "Didn't you expect me to?" He gave her a sidelong look as they walked out of the station. "I was beginning to think you'd run out on me." He laid his hand upon her arm to steer her towards his car. "I did think of it," she admitted. He smiled wryly. "I don't seem very successful in keeping wives, but I should have come after you, you know." "Would you, Clive?" she asked eagerly. He unlocked the car and put her case on the back seat, then stepped aside to let her get in. Standing in the open doorway, he looked down at her enigmatically. "Yes. To ask your pardon. I said some rotten things to you that evening, and I lost control of myself. The last thing I wanted." He broke off and smiled ruefully. "You must admit you were provocative. Still, I should have known better. Not surprising you rushed off to London. But if we are to part, I couldn't let it be in anger." He closed the door and walked round the car to get into his seat, while Angela felt dashed. She had hoped he was going to say he could not do without her, but he seemed to have accepted the possibility of separation, perhaps even welcomed it. He slid in beside her and drove away in silence. They soon left the main road, and Angela thought how quiet and restful the country seemed after the roar of London traffic. They were wending their way along the green valley bottom. A flight of pigeons circled overhead, disturbed by their passage. Hayfields drowsed in the afternoon warmth, unaware of approaching decapitation. It was pastoral England at its best. Rousing herself from her depressing thoughts, she inquired politely after his stepmother, and he confirmed that she was improving. "She won't be coming back to Abbotsford," he told her. "She'll need careful nursing for some time, and after that I shall make our other arrangements." Information which came as a great relief to Angela. "Can we stop?" she asked, resolving she could wait no longer to advise him of his fatherhood. "I've something to tell you." He obligingly drew on to the verge and killed the engine. "I think I know what it is," he told her, and she glanced at him in surprise, for surely he could not have guessed, but it seemed his thoughts were running on totally different lines, for he went on, "And I've something to say to you. I'm thinking of selling Abbotswood." "Oh, no!" she exclaimed involuntarily. "The place is a great tie, and expensive to run," he explained. "It isn't as if Ralph cared about it. Once he's settled in the swinging city, we shan't see much of him. When I'm free of it, I can be off to the ends of the earth if I'm so inclined." He was gazing through the windscreen as if he already saw distant mountains and desert. Angela's heart sank. So he was itching to be off on his travels again. Even Abbotswood could not hold him, much less herself. He would not be pleased to learn about the child. You're taking it for granted that I'm leaving, she said tartly, concealing her hurt. Aren't you? Isn't that what you wanted to tell me? Now you're comfortably off, there's nothing to keep you here. I'll be glad for you to stay until you get your money. It'll take some time to sell the place. Big of you to offer me shelter, she scoffed. But do you really want to wander? Don't you want a home? It seems I'm not destined to have one, he said heavily. Bricks and mortar don't constitute a home, Angela. Of course it would be different if I had a son. He sighed. This remark was definitely more hopeful. She turned in her seat to look at him directly. We could have one, she murmured shyly, but he kept his profile towards her, shaking his head. You'd do better to find a younger man, he said gently. I've watched you with Ralph. Youth turns to youth. What happened to the young man who let you down? Perhaps he'll change his mind now you're wealthy. His lip curled cynically. He married someone else, she told him flatly, and I wouldn't have him at any price. There was no comparison between Arthur and Clive. There are other fish in the sea. Oh, for crying out loud, she exclaimed in exasperation. I'm married to you, Clive. He threw her an odd glance. Surely it can't be you're so bigoted as to shrink from Daddy's grandchildren? He turned his head and stared at her blankly. What an absurd idea. You're not your father. Your family is quite immaterial. Since when did you come to that conclusion? She asked, surprised. To tell the truth, I was completely thrown when you said you were Anne Sullivan. Your name was anathema in our house, and I didn't see how I could take you to Abbotswood. There seemed only one way out, to vanish into the Bolivian jungle and leave the way clear for you to divorce me. But I had to come home, and I couldn't abandon you. Then I began to think more rationally, and I was sure once Mother got to know you, she would be reconciled. Unfortunately, she wasn't, and some time. But not now. I'll prove to you how mistaken you've all been about poor Daddy. She saw disbelief in it. Unfortunately, she wasn't, and sometime, but not now. I'll prove to you how mistaken you've all been about poor Daddy. She saw disbelief in his face. Oh, yes, I can do it. I've been to see a certain Mr. Jack Forrest. You've heard of him? Another of your precious archaeologists. Yes, I've heard of him. He went on that expedition, and he gave me the true facts. So that's what you've been doing up in town, digging up a past which is better buried. I must say you're a loyal daughter, whatever else you are, but I'm not particularly interested. Then you ought to be. I didn't like the nasty aspersions being thrown at him. He was one of the best of men, Angela began heatedly. Clive held up his hand to stop her. Okay, I believe you. His face was sombre, and it flashed into her mind that he must suspect that to exonerate Edmund she would have to blacken Jasmine, and he did not want to know the truth. Then why, if the past is immaterial, did you change towards me, Clive? I thought it must be your antagonism towards Daddy, or you found you couldn't forget Jasmine. He grinned wickedly. Well, of course, forbidden fruit is always attractive, and I was hard put to it to keep away from you. But the truth is, he hesitated, I didn't want to get you pregnant. Angela's newfound confidence withered like frail blossoms before a frost. So he did not want children. He did not wish for them because they might preclude his expeditions. Though he had given up the Bolivian scheme, he had other projects in mind when Abbotsford's affairs were settled and the place was sold. What was she to do? Tell him his caution had come too late? That the first rapturous days of their union had borne fruit? Or should she conceal the knowledge from him, let him go wherever he wished to go, and bear her child in solitude? She had not known until that moment how much she had counted upon her news to effect a reconciliation. She turned away from him to look out the window to hide her quivering lips, and the peaceful scene was blurred before her eyes. It was some moments before she became aware of what he was saying. So much to do, straightening out poor mother's blunders, and I knew I must keep it from her. Once she suspected, she'd have made the hell of a scandal in the hope of driving you away, because I'm afraid she did resent you. Clive, what are you talking about? Please don't be upset, darling, but when I consulted a solicitor in Sherborne, he told me he didn't think our marriage in Kabul was valid in England, and I should get it put right as soon as possible, but I rather shrank from telling you we'd have to have another wedding. And there was poor mother to circumvent. It seemed best to have a register office ceremony in London which she wouldn't know about. But that meant one of us had to be domiciled there for the requisite period. But I haven't had time with one thing and another. Angela began to laugh helplessly. Do you find it funny to live in sin? That sent her into fresh mirth. That sent her into fresh mirth. Oh, Clive! No. Angela began to laugh helplessly. Do you find it funny to live in sin? That sent her into fresh mirth. Oh, Clive, you idiot! She cried when she could speak. Was that all it was? The church gave us its blessing, which was quite enough to be going on with. I never dreamed you'd take it like this, he said with obvious relief. I thought you might imagine I'd taken advantage of your innocent trust, so I kept away from you. That's what I meant when I asked you to be patient. I really was on the point of trying to get a special license. Our children must be perfectly legitimate. Then you'd better get it quickly, Clive, or you'll be too late, Angela told him, her eyes sparkling. He stared at her incredulously with a dawning light in his eyes. You don't mean... She nodded. And that being so, you needn't keep your distance any longer. Oh, my precious waif! His arms closed round her, and all the doubts Angela had been harbouring about his feelings for her were drowned in the ardour of his kiss. Celia Stratton recovered, though she would always limp a little on one leg, but she declared that she could not bring herself to live in the same house as Edmund Sullivan's daughter, which made it easy for Clive to fix her up in a boarding house on the south coast, without having to tell her he had no intention of allowing her to return to Abbotswood. Angela had decided that it would be kinder to keep Jack Forrest's revelations to herself, for Clive seemed indifferent, and even if she could have made any impression upon Celia's obsession, it would be cruel to undeceive her. The one thing Celia asked for from Abbotswood was Jasmine's portrait, and this they were only too pleased to send her. Clive and Angela stood together, watching the lorry taking the crate in which it was packed move down the drive. Clive remarked, I'm glad that's gone. So am I, Angela agreed. While that was here, I always felt that she was still in the house. Excuse me. But she was very lovely. She sighed regretfully. I wish for your sake I was half as beautiful. Clive looked down at her with a tender light in his eyes. To me, you've always been much more beautiful, for your clear, candid soul is mirrored in your face. All the things I said about despising women were prompted by Jasmine's poison. She definitely ought to have been shut up in a seraglio, where her talent would have had full scope. At large among civilized society, she was a public menace. I didn't regret her. But you loved her once, he shook his head. That wasn't love. I never knew what love was. Didn't believe in it until I married you. Hand in hand, they went into the house, which, since her portrait had gone, seemed cleansed of Jasmine's presence. At last I feel this is home, Angela said. Clive slipped his arm about her waist. Your home, my home, and our children's home, he told her. I shall go no more a-rowing, my beloved. All I want is here. The end.